One week after the unthinkable happened, Rob Reiner's name wasn't just trending, it was haunting Hollywood. Not because of the movies, not because of the legacy, but because of what happened next. A private funeral was arranged, quiet, closed, hidden from cameras, hidden from the world. And yet, from the very first moment the details began to leak, the entire night felt wrong because the people who should have been there weren't. The friends who had stood beside Rob for decades, the faces that helped build his career, the voices that once filled his home with laughter. They never received an invitation. They weren't even given an explanation. Imagine that. A man spends a lifetime building relationships, creating memories, surviving Hollywood, surviving life. And when the final goodbye arrives, the doors are locked, names erased, calls ignored. And when those closest friends finally pushed for answers, the replies weren't gentle. They were cold. "My father's funeral is none of your business." That sentence alone sent a shiver through the entire circle around Rob Reiner, because funerals aren't usually about power. But this one was. Romy and Jake Reiner, the two biological children, now in control of everything, made it clear. This farewell would happen on their terms, their rules, their guest list. And then came the detail that truly stunned people. Tracy Reiner wasn't invited, not just a distant acquaintance, not a forgotten relative. Tracy, the adopted daughter Rob had loved dearly, a woman he had raised, supported, and treated like family in every way that mattered. But Romy and Jake insisted Tracy was an outsider. They argued that she had already received an inheritance, and in their eyes, that was more than enough. So in their minds, she didn't deserve a seat in the final chapter of the man who had once called her his daughter. And the more people heard that, the more the funeral stopped sounding like a gathering of grief and started sounding like something else. A controlled operation, a quiet purge, a final act of separation. Because once Tracy's name was revealed as missing, everyone started asking the same question. If she could be excluded, then who else was erased? Which familiar faces were shut out of the lost goodbye? And why? Because when a funeral becomes a guest list, it stops being about mourning, it becomes a message. And the message this time was terrifyingly clear. Some people were not welcome, not even to say goodbye. And as the names began to surface one by one, each absence felt more personal, more deliberate, more heartbreaking, like a wound that wasn't closing but opening wider. So now the question isn't just who wasn't invited. The real question is, what were Romy and Jake so afraid might happen if these people were allowed inside? For Tracy Reiner, the silence hurt more than the rejection. She didn't hear the news from a phone call. She didn't receive a private explanation. She found out the same way the rest of the world did, through whispers, through unanswered messages, through the painful realization that the doors to her own father's goodbye were already closed. Tracy had spent most of her life being introduced not as adopted, but simply as Rob's daughter. Rob Reiner never corrected anyone. He never distanced himself. He never treated her as less. To him, family wasn't defined by blood. It was defined by love. And for decades, Tracy was part of that love. She was present during the quiet moments of his life, the moments the cameras never saw, the struggles, the celebrations, the long dinners where stories were repeated and laughter came easily. So when the funeral plans were finalized without her name on the list, the shock wasn't just emotional, it was existential. Because exclusion from a funeral isn't just about missing a ceremony. It's about being erased from the story. And that's exactly how it felt. Behind closed doors, Romy and Jake justified their decision with cold logic. They insisted Tracy had already been taken care of, that she had received money in the past, that inheritance had been settled. But grief doesn't operate on balance sheets, and love doesn't expire after a payout. To Tracy, the funeral wasn't about property, status, or control. It was about standing in one final room, breathing the same air, and saying goodbye to the man who raised her. That chance was taken away. And what made it worse was the tone. There was no empathy, no acknowledgement of shared pain, only distance, only boundaries, only a quiet message sent without words. You are no longer one of us. People close to the family later said Tracy didn't fight publicly. She didn't go to the press. She didn't demand attention. She grieved in private, which ironically mirrored the way she had lived much of her life, always present, always loyal, never loud. And as her exclusion became known, it sparked something unexpected. Because Tracy wasn't the only name missing. She was just the first. Once people realized even a daughter could be denied entry, Hollywood insiders began quietly comparing notes. And that's when the pattern emerged. Old friends, longtime collaborators, people who had stood beside Rob Reiner for decades, all discovering they had been cut out, not by accident, but by design. So the question now grows darker. If Tracy Reiner could be erased so easily, who else was deemed inconvenient enough to be left outside? Once the reality sank in, the silence around Rob Reiner's funeral began to feel unnatural, because Tracy wasn't the only one standing on the outside. Quietly, almost cautiously, longtime friends began reaching out to one another. Private messages, late-night phone calls, short sentences filled with disbelief. Did you get an invite? I didn't. Neither did I. These weren't casual acquaintances. These were people who had shared decades with Rob, people who had been there before the awards, before the acclaim, before the legacy hardened into history, men and women who had celebrated his victories, defended him during failures, and stayed loyal when Hollywood turned cold. And yet, when the final goodbye came, their names never appeared. No explanation, no courtesy call, no acknowledgement of shared history, just absence. At first, many assumed it was a mistake. Funerals are chaotic, emotions are raw, lists can be incomplete, but as more names compared notes, one truth became unavoidable. This wasn't an oversight, it was intentional. A boundary had been drawn, and only a very specific group was allowed to cross it. What made it even more painful was the way people found out. Not from the family, not from an organizer, but from seeing others attend. Photos circulated quietly, a handful of faces inside, a controlled, carefully curated circle, and suddenly those left out began to understand something far more unsettling. This funeral wasn't just about mourning Rob Reiner, it was about redefining him. By controlling who was present, Romy and Jake weren't just managing logistics. They were shaping the narrative of their father's life, who mattered, who counted, who would be remembered as part of his world, and everyone else was being written out. For many of these friends, the pain wasn't anger, it was confusion. They didn't want recognition, they didn't want speeches, they didn't want attention. They just wanted to stand quietly, pay respect, and say goodbye. Instead, they were forced to grieve alone, questioning whether the years they spent with Rob had meant as much to him as they believed, or worse, whether those years had been erased the moment he was no longer there to defend them. And that's when a darker realization began to form. If the funeral was being used to draw lines, what else was being controlled behind the scenes? Because funerals are supposed to close a chapter, but this one felt like the beginning of something far more divisive. As the excluded names grew longer, the mood around the funeral shifted from grief to suspicion, because what people were starting to realize was deeply unsettling. This wasn't chaos, it was control. Romy and Jake weren't overwhelmed children making emotional decisions in a moment of pain. Every move was calculated. Every boundary was deliberate. The guest list wasn't just short, it was curated. Only those who aligned with a very specific version of Rob Reiner were allowed inside. A version that could be managed. A version that couldn't argue back. People close to the family began to notice how carefully the narrative was being protected. Conversations redirected. Questions shut down. Even neutral curiosity was treated like hostility, and the message became clearer with every passing hour. This funeral was private, but not intimate, exclusive, but not loving. It was a closed room where grief followed rules. Some insiders later said that the atmosphere inside felt strangely hollow, quiet in the wrong way, like something essential was missing, because grief, when real, is messy. But this wasn't messy. It was sterile, and that raised a frightening possibility. What if the funeral wasn't about honoring Rob Reiner at all? What if it was about ownership? By limiting who could attend, Romy and Jake controlled not only the space, but the memories, the stories, the version of Rob that would live on. No old friends sharing anecdotes, no unexpected moments of truth, no voices that might contradict the image being preserved, just silence. And outside that silence were people who had known Rob long enough to recognize what was missing. They remembered a man who welcomed people, who valued loyalty, who didn't draw lines so sharply, which made the situation even more painful, because the man they were mourning would likely never have approved of what was happening in his name. And that's when whispers turned into something louder, not outrage, but concern. Concern that this funeral was less a farewell and more a final act of erasure. And if that was true, then the question became unavoidable. If Romy and Jake were willing to rewrite the ending of their father's life, what else were they rewriting behind closed doors? By the time the funeral ended, the damage had already been done. There were no dramatic confrontations, no public accusations, no explosive headlines, just something far more lasting, a fracture. People who had once shared a common grief now found themselves separated by invisible lines they never agreed to draw. For those left outside, the pain lingered in quiet moments, sitting alone, replaying memories, wondering how a lifetime of loyalty could end with a locked door and unanswered messages. And for Romy and Jake, control came at a cost they may not have anticipated. Because when you decide who gets to say goodbye, you also decide who will remember, and memory has a way of resisting control. Friends began sharing the stories privately, not out of spite, but out of necessity. They needed to grieve together, even if it couldn't happen in the same room. They spoke about the warmth, the humor, the generosity that never made it into official narratives. A version of Rob that existed outside, curated guest lists, and controlled silence. And slowly that version began to live on, not through ceremonies, not through permission, but through human connection. The funeral may have been closed, but grief found its own way out. And perhaps that's the quiet irony of it all. You can control a room, you can control a list, you can even control a moment. But you can't control how people remember the truth, because in the end, a legacy isn't decided by who stands inside a building. It's decided by who carries you forward when the doors are closed. In the weeks that followed, the funeral quietly faded from public attention. But the feeling it left behind did not. For many, the exclusion wasn't remembered as a single painful event, but as a revelation, a moment that exposed how fragile relationships can become when control replaces compassion. Those who were denied entry eventually reached a difficult understanding. The funeral they imagined was never going to happen. Not because Rob Reiner wouldn't have wanted them there, but because the people left behind wanted something different, something smaller, something quieter, something easier to manage. And so they grieved in their own ways. Some revisited old letters, some replayed old voicemails, some gathered in living rooms far away from cameras, sharing stories that would never make headlines, stories of kindness, stories of loyalty, stories that proved their place in Rob's life was real, no matter what the guest list said. Ironically, the attempt to control the farewell did the opposite of what was intended. Instead of creating unity, it created distance. Instead of preserving dignity, it raised questions. Instead of closing a chapter, it left one permanently unfinished, because a funeral is supposed to be the final moment of togetherness, and this one wasn't. Yet perhaps the most telling truth lies here. Legacies aren't decided in private rooms. They aren't protected by locked doors. They aren't owned by a select few. They live in the people who remember you honestly, in the ones who still say your name softly, in the ones who still feel the loss even when they weren't allowed inside. And in that sense, Rob Reiner's story didn't end at a controlled farewell. It continued quietly, imperfectly, and truthfully in the hearts of those who loved him without conditions. And sometimes that is the only goodbye that truly matters.